Failure to meet Hitler's expectations was not just a career setback. For many Nazi generals, it was a death sentence. The darkest aspects of Nazi Germany's leadership, the ruthless punishment of generals who failed to live up to Adolf Hitler's increasingly unrealistic expectations. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's paranoia reached new heights, and even the most accomplished military minds were not immune to his wrath. Adolf Hitler's leadership during World War II was marked by increasing paranoia, which ultimately led to the brutal punishment of those who failed to meet his ever-growing expectations. The consequences of this were nothing short of catastrophic, as failure often resulted in not only the downfall of a career, but in some cases, a death sentence. As Nazi Germany neared collapse, Hitler's decisions became more erratic and tyrannical, driven by his deep distrust of his generals, his military leaders, and even his closest advisors. This atmosphere of fear and blind obedience shaped the downfall of numerous prominent figures within Hitler's inner circle, who found themselves caught in his web of suspicion and retribution. The fate of these generals illustrates the destructive consequences of following a flawed and increasingly irrational leader. Today, we explore the tragic story of several high-ranking Nazi officials who met untimely and violent ends as a result of their perceived disloyalty to Hitler. One of the first prominent generals to feel the wrath of Hitler was General Heinrich Hoppner, an officer renowned for his military expertise. Hoppner played a significant role in Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which began in June 1941. His leadership in the 4th Panzer Group was instrumental during the early stages of the operation, which aimed to decisively crush Soviet resistance and capture key territories. Initially, Hoppner shared Hitler's vision for a rapid, overwhelming victory. However, as the German forces advanced into Soviet territory, the situation took a turn for the worse. The brutal winter of 1941 proved to be a harsh opponent, and the Soviet Red Army launched a fierce counteroffensive, which forced Hoppner to confront a grim reality. The German forces could not maintain their advance, and were in danger of being decimated if they did not retreat. Hoppner, understanding the gravity of the situation, made the difficult decision to order a retreat in January 1942, hoping to preserve his forces. This decision, however, did not sit well with Hitler. To the Führer, any form of retreat was a clear sign of weakness and failure. Hitler's obsession with victory at all costs left no room for pragmatism or retreat, especially when it came to his ambitious plan for the conquest of the Soviet Union. As a result, Hitler dismissed Hoppner from command, stripping him of his rank and pension. This punishment was not just about Hoppner's military failure. It symbolized the unforgiving and ruthless nature of the Nazi regime under Hitler. The regime tolerated no dissent or disobedience, no matter how logical or necessary it might be in the context of war. Hoppner's fate underscores the devastating consequences of challenging Hitler's leadership, even when his decisions defied military logic. Another infamous example of Hitler's brutal punishment of his generals occurred during the catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad. In 1942, Hitler became fixated on capturing the Soviet city of Stalingrad, which he believed would be a major turning point in the war and a vital prize for Nazi Germany. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus, who had been promoted due to his World War I service and his record in France and the Balkans, was entrusted with leading the German 6th Army during the operation. Hitler's confidence in Paulus was high, and the general's leadership was expected to bring victory. Initially, the German forces made rapid advances, capturing much of Stalingrad by October 1942. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated when the Soviet Red Army, led by General Zhukov, launched a massive counterattack known as Operation Uranus in November 1942. As the winter set in, the conditions for the trapped German forces became unbearable. Starvation, disease, and constant Soviet attacks eroded the morale of Paulus' men. As the situation worsened, Paulus repeatedly asked Hitler for permission to surrender, knowing full well that his forces were doomed. However, Hitler's orders were clear: no surrender under any circumstances. He demanded that Stalingrad be held at all costs, even if it meant the destruction of the entire German 6th Army. The cost of disobedience was absolute. Failure meant death, not just for Paulus, but for every soldier under his command. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was on the brink of collapse. The men were starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition. Despite his dire circumstances, Paulus continued to beg Hitler for permission to surrender, but each request was rejected. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, an honor that carried an ominous expectation. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. This promotion was Hitler's way of telling Paulus that he had no choice but to continue fighting or take his own life in accordance with the Führer's policy. Facing an impossible choice, and with his men dying from hunger and exposure, Paulus ignored Hitler's unspoken demand for suicide and chose to surrender to the Soviet forces on January 31st, 1943. This marked a historic moment, as Paulus became the first German officer of his rank to be taken alive by the enemy. The surrender was a profound act of defiance against Hitler's orders, and it marked the end of any illusions about the invincibility of the Nazi regime. While Paulus's surrender marked a personal tragedy for him and his men, it also triggered a larger crisis of faith within the Nazi leadership. The ramifications of this defeat were felt across the German military, and Hitler's response was one of anger and vengeance. As his leadership faltered, he became more paranoid and increasingly hostile to those around him. The consequences of his irrational leadership reached a new level in July 1944, with the failed assassination attempt against him, known as Operation Valkyrie. On July 20th, 1944, a group of high-ranking military officers, disillusioned by Hitler's disastrous decisions and the direction of the war, plotted to assassinate him and take control of the government. The plan was masterminded by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, who planted a bomb in a conference room where Hitler was meeting with his generals. The explosion did not kill Hitler, who emerged with only minor injuries, much to the dismay of the conspirators. In the aftermath of the failed coup, Hitler's paranoia reached new heights. He ordered the swift execution of anyone suspected of being involved in the plot, including high-ranking officers who had been mentioned in connection with the assassination. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most respected generals, found himself implicated in the conspiracy. Despite having had no direct involvement, Rommel had previously been critical of Hitler's leadership and the direction of the war, and he had come to believe that Germany's best chance of survival lay in negotiating a peace settlement with the Allies. Faced with a choice of either public disgrace or execution, Rommel chose to end his own life. The purge following the failed assassination attempt was not limited to those directly involved in the plot. The Nazi regime, in its quest to maintain control, arrested over 7,000 individuals suspected of conspiring against Hitler. Nearly 5,000 were executed, many without trial or due process. Heinrich Hoppner, who had previously been dismissed by Hitler for his decision to retreat in 1942, was arrested and tortured by the Gestapo. Despite being stripped of his rank, Hoppner remained a target of suspicion due to his connection with Operation Valkyrie. He was executed by hanging with piano wire on August 8, 1944, in a method intended to prolong his suffering. In the final months of the war, as Germany's defeat seemed imminent, Hitler issued the infamous Nero Decree, a directive that called for the destruction of all German infrastructure. This included factories, power plants, railways, and communication lines. Essentially everything that could potentially aid the Allies after Germany's collapse. Hitler, consumed by paranoia and despair, believed that if Germany could not win the war, it should be destroyed completely. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, was entrusted with overseeing the implementation of the Nero Decree. However, Speer recognized the folly of the order and its disastrous consequences for Germany's future. In a rare act of defiance, Speer persuaded other high-ranking officials to ignore Hitler's order, arguing that the resources would be needed for Germany's post-war reconstruction. His sabotage of the Nero Decree ultimately thwarted Hitler's plans and helped prevent further devastation in Germany, although it marked a final betrayal of his once loyal service to Hitler. The collapse of Nazi Germany in the final weeks of the war was not just the result of military defeat, but of a complete breakdown of trust within the German leadership. Many of Hitler's closest allies and generals chose suicide over facing the consequences of their association with the regime. Figures such as Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and other high-ranking officials ended their lives, unable to cope with the reality of Germany's destruction and the horrors of the war. In these final days, the fear of reprisals, particularly from the Soviet Union, played a significant role in the decision of many to take their own lives rather than face capture. The Nazi propaganda that glorified death before surrender had created a toxic culture where surrender was seen as the ultimate betrayal. For many high-ranking officials, suicide was the only way out of the nightmare they had helped create. The fates of these generals and military officers serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind loyalty and obedience to a leader who is fundamentally flawed. They remind us of the importance of moral courage and the need to think critically, even under the most extreme pressure. Blind allegiance to a tyrant, whether it is Adolf Hitler or any other dictator, can lead to catastrophic consequences, not just for the individual, but for the entire nation. Their deaths highlight the importance of questioning authority, thinking for oneself, and having the courage to resist when faced with a destructive leadership. What do you think? Could you have defied Hitler? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking videos on the most complex and disturbing events in history. See you next time!